I'm very pleased to introduce Dr. Karen Swallow Pryor to speak on our topic tonight. She believes, as I do, that the most important thing about you is what you believe about God. Socrates famously said, "The unexamined life is not worth living." Tonight, we may see that unexamined beliefs are not worth holding. Dr. Pryor will share her wisdom on how to best navigate our faith journeys amidst cultural chaos and doubt. Dr. Pryor is research professor of English and Christianity and Culture at Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary. She's the author of Booked Literature in the Soul of Me, Fierce Convictions, The Extraordinary Life of Hannah More, Poet, Reformer, Abolitionist, and On Reading Well, Finding the Good Life Through Great Books. She's the co-editor of the book Cultural Engagement, A Crash Course in Contemporary Issues, and has contributed to numerous other books. She's the host of the popular podcast Jane and Jesus. She has a monthly column for Religion News Service. Her writing has appeared in Christianity Today, New York Times, The Atlantic, The Washington Post, First Things, and Vox, among others. She's a contributing editor for Comment, a founding member of the Pelican Project, a senior fellow at the Trinity Forum, and a senior fellow at the International Alliance for Christian Education. She's a senior fellow at the L. Russ Bush Center for Faith and Culture, and she's a former member of the Faith Advisory Council of the Humane Society of the United States. She and her husband live on a 100-year-old homestead in Central Virginia with dogs, chickens, and lots of books. Welcome, Dr. Pryor. I'm going to now turn the floor over to you.
Thank you so much for that lovely and long introduction. I'm exhausted listening to it, but I'm so sorry that I couldn't be with all of you in person tonight. The weather had different plans, and I'm so grateful for all of the time and effort and planning and flexibility that all of the sponsoring organizations put into this. And I know a lot of these decisions aren't easy to make in the moment, but certainly the one to let me stay home and not get on the plane before it was too late was a good one. And I'm just glad for the gift of modern technology so that we can still have this conversation together, because I was really excited about it. I love talking to students. That's my life, is teaching, and I do a lot of speaking, but talking with students is my favorite. And I think because of the chatter I've heard on Twitter and in my direct messages, there might be some other people who aren't students who are here listening, and some, I guess once you're an Aggie, you're always an Aggie. And if I were there, I would have said something that I think would have gotten cheers from the crowd, but I don't know what that is. So you can cheer wherever you are at home. Part of the great planning that the students and organizers put into this event, which goes back quite a ways, was really homing in on the topic and even the title of my lecture. And we went back and forth a lot, and they made the final decision. And I really love this idea, of reconsidering faith. It's such a provocative phrase. And even just thinking about that, talking about it, reconsidering faith, it assumes already kind of a context of questioning and doubt. And it's hard for us in the modern age to imagine a pre-secular world. And here I'm using the terms of Charles Taylor, his book, A Secular Age, which some of you may have heard of, but it's hard for us to imagine a pre-secular world in which faith was just assumed and religious doubt was almost unimaginable. Probably for most people, it really was literally unimaginable. But now we're in almost a reverse situation. It's hard for many of us to imagine assuming faith and not being or having some kind of doubt. So I just want to start with just a little bit of a broad picture, because there really are so many ways to doubt. I study English literature, so I'll paraphrase a 19th century British poet, Elizabeth Barrett Browning, and ask, "How do I doubt thee, God? Let me count the ways." We could probably all count a lot of ways, even if we can't write a sonnet about it. But there are a lot of ways to doubt, and we can look back in history and see a lot of them. We can start maybe with doubting Thomas from the Bible, who needed to touch the wounds of the risen Christ before he could believe. And then we go a little bit further forward in history, and there's Augustine, whose many ways of doubting, not to mention, he had many ways of doubting, not to mention many ways of sinning. Lord grant me chastity, but not yet, he's famous for saying. But his doubts resulted in one of the world's greatest works of literature. So there is that. There's a gift to us. And then we move a little closer to the modern era, and we have Blaise Pascal and his famous wager. And his philosophical uncertainty, he kind of approached it from a mathematical point of view, and basically said that, that there would be, he would err on the side of faith rather than doubt, because in the end, doing so would do less harm. Now, that's a great oversimplification of really an interesting approach, but Pascal also struggled with doubt. And then we get even more into the heart of the modern era, and we have the 18th century French philosopher Voltaire, whose doubt arose from a terrible natural disaster, the Lisbon earthquake of 1755. This earthquake occurred in the city of Lisbon, obviously, and it occurred on All Saints' Day, a day when many people had come into the city, not only into the city, but actually into the churches to worship. And because they were there in the city and in the churches, when the walls crumbled across the city, many more people died than would have if they had not all been gathered there. There were actually tens of thousands of people who died because of the earthquake directly or because of the fires that tore through the city. And this was just a time of crisis for Voltaire in his faith. And he wrote a poem to mark some of that and lament some of that. And bear with me, I teach English. I'll be reading a few lines of poetry, not much. But from this poem, he lamented after that earthquake, "Behold these shreds and cinders of your race, this child and mother heaped in common wreck, these scattered limbs beneath the marble shafts, 100,000 whom the earth devours, who torn and bloody, palpitating yet, entombed beneath their hospitable roofs, in racking torment, end their stricken lives." What a picture he paints of the people who had gathered under the marble arches of the church to worship God and lost their lives as a result. These kinds of things would make anyone doubt, and they made one of the greatest minds of the 18th century doubt. So we can see doubt in the form of disbelief that God can be raised from the dead, or doubt that resolves itself in a kind of mathematical equation, or doubt that resolves by writing a long book of confessions and wrestling through it, or doubt rooted in pain, sorrow, and anger at God simply for allowing evil. And then I think there's the more existential kind of doubt, the doubt born of the late modern age that we're in, one that, as I mentioned before, can no longer just take God's existence for granted, let alone his goodness. This is the kind of doubt that's expressed not so much in the rejection of something, I think, but more of a yearning for the real thing, whatever that is. It's the sort of existential angst that's given voice closer to our own time yet by the American poet from the 19th century, Walt Whitman. In one of my favorite poems, and I'm going to read that. It's a noiseless patient spider. And in this poem, he compares the travails of this humble, ugly little creature of a spider to the human soul. So pay attention to this connection that Whitman makes, not only to any human soul, but just ours in this kind of existence where we don't know if God exists or we believe in him. A noiseless, patient spider. I marked where on a little promontory it stood, isolated. Marked how to explore the vacant, vast surrounding It launched forth filament, filament, filament out of itself, ever unreeling them, ever tirelessly speeding them. And you, O my soul, where you stand, surrounded in measureless oceans of space, ceaselessly musing, venturing, throwing, seeking the spheres to connect them, till the bridge you will need be formed, till the ductile anchor hold, till the gossamer thread you fling catch somewhere, O my soul. I think doubt, especially today, is just an expression of us trying to throw something out that will catch and let our souls connect to something bigger and beyond ourselves. So that is where I think many of us find us here today, whether we consider ourselves to be believers or not. We still live in this context of constant doubt. And there are still many ways to doubt, just as there always have been. And yet somehow it seems to me that the sources of doubt that really your generation, and I'm talking to you students, that the sources of doubt that your generation faces right now are a little bit different, maybe even a lot different today. I feel like in my lifetime, I've seen some of these sources of doubt change over time. Some of you grew up in the church. You grew up loving Jesus, loving Sunday school, loving youth group and lock-ins. Do they still do lock-ins? I don't know. Some of you were taught wrong things, however. And some of you were told that if you did X, you'd receive Y. Some of you were told that if you didn't believe B, you were C. Or that if you did believe B, but not exactly in the way of EFG, you were also C. Are you tracking with me? Some of you were lied to. And some of you were hurt. Some of you were betrayed. Some of you were abused. And I'll be honest, I've never experienced most of those things, but I've never experienced what I'm watching so many of you go through today. In fact, until pretty recently, I've never really had much reason to doubt much about the churches or the ministries of the church that I've been involved in my whole life. I've been pretty lucky, I guess. Hashtag blessed, right? Or maybe I've just been naive. But having taught now in Christian institutions for over 20 years, I've watched a lot of my students struggle with doubt. And more often than not always, but often, that doubt is rooted in disappointment or betrayal by people, not necessarily God. So I think that this is the root of the movement we've witnessed recently of believers or former believers deconstructing their faith. Now, to be sure, there are some people who do abandon the faith, who truly turn from belief to disbelief, who become those whom the traditional church calls apostates. Today, they might call themselves having deconverts or going through a process of deconversion. And this is a real thing. People who once professed belief do sometimes renounce that belief. Now, theologians and other people like to debate whether or not, they were ever truly saved. And, that's an interesting doctrinal question and an important one. But in the end, at least for this discussion, doesn't really matter. There are people who truly renounce their faith. But I'm convinced that many of the folks I see who are facing disorienting and debilitating doubt are confronting demons that are more of human origin. So that's why last year I wrote an article for my monthly column at Religion News Service calling for a right kind of deconstruction, a deconstruction that's parallel to the task we face when we remodel a home. I was inspired by actual remodeling we were doing. I say we, really, my husband, the royal we, I just supervised. But we were doing some remodeling, and after peeling away the layers, found a lot of things under the layers that we weren't expecting. And so the job turned into something bigger than we thought, although he sort of always expects those things. He's more experienced than I am at these projects. But that kind of deconstruction involves peeling away the surface, the layers, the veneer. And if we find something rotten underneath, it has to be taken away. It has to be rebuilt in order for something strong and beautiful to be put in its place. Now, I know that there are a whole range of reasons why people doubt, whether it's they doubting what the Bible says or what the authority of the Bible is, or whether it really is the word of God, or what the evidence is that it is. And there are countless books, podcasts, and apologetics ministries out there that address a lot of these questions about evidence and proof. And I'm not addressing that tonight, but we can certainly talk about some of those resources in the discussion. Instead, I want to address, from my own context and my experience working with students and having friends and being a human being, I guess, I want to address a couple of the human-made sources of doubt that I've seen over and over with people that I know wrestling over the years. And these are cultural constructs as opposed to biblical truths that do at times warrant deconstruction. They are human or culturally constructed, so therefore they often meet a time of needing to be deconstructed or dismantled. And again, as I've said, people abandon the faith for many reasons, many man-made reasons. But one stumbling block that I've encountered a lot and wrote about that I think is one of the reasons I was invited to come and talk tonight is anti-intellectualism. And it's just deeply ironic that for centuries, many of the most revolutionary and groundbreaking scientific discoveries in history were made by those who adhered to the Christian faith. And the church actively supported the advance of this kind of knowledge. But eventually, for lots of complicated reasons over the course of human history that I won't get into right now, the church eventually failed simply to compete well with scientific theories that posed increasing challenges to Christian belief. However, as we enter what some are calling the postmodern age or late modernity, the rejection of the rigid scientific categories that we associate with the modern age that began with Enlightenment, which is sort of the beginning of the scientific revolution, we're calling many of those things into question. The human-made binaries and categories no longer necessarily hold. Now, questioning these categories, the same categories that have taught us about the cosmos and the universe and the stars and brought us the technology that allows us to have this meeting over Zoom tonight. So a lot of these binary categories are valid and important and have brought us to the life that we have today. But some of them, are ones that don't line up with biblical truth or the order of the universe as God created it. And questioning some of these long-held scientific modern categories is risky, but it can also open up the possibility for a more holistic understanding that sees reason and faith as less opposed than we've tended to understand for the past few centuries. So, for example, younger Christians, who have been discipled, many of you, within a framework of what we call the Christian worldview, have been taught by people like me for many years to integrate all aspects of life into a biblical framework. But some of you are starting to question some inconsistencies in that integration, some moral blind spots that some of us in the older generations have. And some of these challenges, I would argue, are bearing some good fruit because we all have blind spots. We all have moral blind spots. I spent a lot of time studying the 18th and 19th centuries, particularly in Great Britain. And it's very easy to find devout Christians and and famous theologians who are foundational to belief today, who had a moral blind spot about some issues that seem very obvious to us today, such as slavery. And we are not immune from similar blind spots. We're no different from our ancestors. And so some of this questioning and this challenging that is coming from new generations of believers is bearing this kind of fruit. I know I personally have learned so much from my students for this reason. Many of us have learned and are still learning from you. But of course, the ancient creeds, confessions, and doctrines that define the church universal and timeless have not changed and cannot change. But the application of these truths within any particular human culture will inevitably reflect the qualities and quirks of that age. For the modern Western church, one of these characteristics has been this centuries-old tension between faith and science, which has bred this kind of anti-intellectualism that I'm talking about. And according to recent research by Barna, this perceived conflict between science and Christianity is a tremendous barrier of faith for younger Christians today. Some of you, I'm sure, have experienced that. Erica Carlson, a physics professor at Purdue University and a Christian, has spoken about this problem, particularly for Christian students in the sciences. Just as she herself experienced while she was a teenager, she sees now as a professor Christian young people coming to college ill-equipped to reconcile the competing truth claims of Christianity and academia. And as a result, often these Christian young people feel they must choose between them. I'll talk a little bit later about my own experience with this in my area of study. Too many young people in the church have not been taught a hierarchy of ideas within Christian theology. In my Baptist context, we talk about these as first order and second order and third order doctrines. This is the difference between the essentials of the Christian faith, those essentials being found in those confessions and creeds that have been around since the beginning of the church that I mentioned earlier, and these second or third order doctrines. And so without knowing any difference or being able to create a hierarchy of the importance of these doctrinal beliefs, young people or older people often develop what Carlson calls a glass theology. She compares it to a car that's made of glass that has no shock absorbers. And so when the first time that it bumps up against something and there's a small kind of crash, the whole thing shatters because there's no buffer, no shock absorber to prevent that kind of shattering. Or to use another image by another apologist, the failure to make these kinds of distinctions between different orders of doctrines can create a house of cards faith. If all of the doctrines are equally important and you remove one card, then the whole house collapses. And I know some of you, because I've been teaching long enough, I know some of you are in that moment where there is one card that is being pulled out from under you and you are feeling like the whole house is about to collapse. And that's not how it has to be. But more and more, I'm finding that young people are seeking more consistent application of biblical teaching in all areas of life: environmental stewardship, racial justice, the global church, human trafficking, abuse, all of these things that haven't always been at the forefront of this application of Christian worldview in years past. But these issues I want to emphasize, even though I've been talking in this part of the lecture about anti-intellectualism, these issues aren't necessarily just intellectual. Of course they are, but they often present that way because when someone raises a concern or asks a question, seeking understanding or striving for logical coherence, sometimes those conversations or discussions are resisted or pushed away. And so then it feels like an anti-intellectual approach, an approach that will not wrestle with hard questions. But the church needs these questions to be asked. The church needs you, it needs all of us to keep asking the questions. How do we get beyond our own cultural assumptions in order to see and apply biblical truth in its entirety? We have to recognize that we will always have moral blind spots, and those blind spots will change from generation to generation. Of course, God is in his mercy always gives us prophets who see beyond those blind spots as well, but that doesn't mean we listen to them. So we need to ask these questions with passion and urgency, but also humility, knowing that they will always be with us until the new heaven and the new earth. So just a little bit about my story and how I have experienced this too. I asked Jesus into my heart before I was 5 years old, but it was many years before I asked him into my mind. Now, in fairness to myself, it was a long time before I realized that my mind was a place where Jesus not only needed to be, but where he wanted to be. My own experience growing up in the church was one in which I didn't see a place for my love, my intellectual passion, which is books. I didn't see a place in the church for that, or for asking the kinds of questions that all the books that I read helped me to ask. My next column, by the way, will be on book banning and censorship, because that's been in the news a lot. And when I was growing up reading all kinds of sketchy books that most parents today probably wouldn't in Christian homes when other kids read, I'm thankful my parents were they were Christians, but they let me read whatever I wanted to read. And those books caused me to ask questions and think about things that I would never otherwise have encountered or thought about in my life. And I think God has used that in my ministry now in the church. But the book of Matthew tells us that Jesus admonishes us to love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. And I didn't accomplish all those loves at once. In fact, I think I kind of followed the order of that verse, first with my heart, then with my soul, and much, much later in life did I love him with my mind. And that was actually the stumbling block for me, because I didn't know I was supposed to love him with my mind and use my mind and stretch my mind in pursuit of him, meaning asking all those questions. But when I did, I finally was able to at least begin to love God with my whole being. Obviously, a lifelong kind of quest. But before that, I thought I had to choose between the life of the mind and love of God. So for a while, I compartmentalized. I went to church on Sunday and taught Sunday school and went to youth group, and my parents made me go to youth group. And the rest of the time, I read books, went to college, pursued the life of the mind, went into a PhD program. And ironically, it took an unbelieving professor at my secular liberal university to show me the deep, rich tradition of Christian thinkers that is our heritage. And so later, as I continued my studies and expanded them from literature to aesthetics and philosophy, I discovered a trove of brilliant Christian minds that have been assigned significant weight within the academic community, regardless of their being Christians or because they were Christians. And I came to see that it was my own view of the Christian intellectual tradition that was narrow and limited as it was to my own personal experience, that I'd been the one kind of shutting off a whole area of intellect and intellectual history given to us by Christians, because I didn't know, but also because I didn't see. It was a blind spot. So I was guilty of the same narrowness of mind that I was accusing others of. So while I've never really struggled with doubt, the kind I think, we're really talking and thinking about tonight, doubt about God's existence or the truth of the Bible or the witness and teachings of the historic church, I have faced doubt. I've faced doubt through, as I've already mentioned, teaching many years of students who've wrestled with those, through friends who've searched, but even more through all of the works of literature that I've read, and some of the greatest thinkers in human history who have wrestled with doubts that I would never have been imaginative enough to come up with, and they have wrestled through them. And people sometimes journey from faith to doubt, and I've known people. Some of them come back to faith, others have not, and perhaps never will not. And I know many who began in doubt or unbelief and then came to faith. My own faith journey has been one of faith pretty much from the beginning. It was very, very slow, yet pretty steady and straight. But it hasn't been a blind faith. I've asked a lot of questions along the way. It should never be a blind faith. It doesn't need to be, and it shouldn't be. But anti-intellectualism isn't just about education. I want to stress that, because there's a whole phenomenon. I don't know if it has a name, but some of you will know what I'm talking about. And it's when college freshmen, well, this is traditional college, and I know you guys have all been and not had a very traditional college experience the past couple of years, but because of COVID. But traditionally, a student, a young person will go to college for that first semester, come home at Thanksgiving, and see for the first time how dumb everyone at home is, and have this sort of snobbish view of who they are because they've been away for a few weeks. And it's a very unsettling experience on both ends for the parents who don't quite recognize the child that's come home, the young person that's come home, and then the young person who comes home a little bit full of him or herself, because they've gotten all this book learning and education. And that's actually why the second year students are called sophomores. If you don't know, that comes from the Greek meaning wise fool, because a sophomore who's learned a little bit often can feel like they know much more than they do. So anti-intellectualism is not about education. No one should go home or leave college with a 4-year degree or go on to another program and feel superior to the people back home, family members or whomever who don't have degrees or haven't gone to school or haven't attained as much education. That anti-intellectualism knows no bounds. It can be found among those with all the degrees in any generation, in any economic or social class. So one should never confuse lack of education with hostility toward it or with ignorance. Some very educated people buy into conspiracy theories, for example, and thoughtful engagement with ideas is hardly more common among white-collar workers than blue-collar workers or farmers. I live in farm country. I know what I'm talking about, and I'm sure a lot of you do too. Anti-intellectualism has nothing to do with degree or social or economic class. So it's really important to distinguish true anti-intellectualism from generational, cultural, and personal differences in values and ways of knowing. Just because I am someone who loves books and classrooms and research, for example, doesn't mean that I have a more curious mind than someone who works with their hands or digs in the garden or drives a truck or knits sweaters or plants vegetable gardens. Really, I think there probably is nothing more anti-intellectual than a lack of humility, for no true learning can take place without it. So please don't confuse anti-intellectualism with humility, because that's the most important. But it's also important to note that in his ministry on earth, Jesus modeled a love of hard questions. He welcomed them from others, and he asked hard questions of others. He told parables that demand intellectual engagement for spiritual understanding. And he even instructed believers to live in harmony with one another. Do not be haughty, but associate with the lowly. Never be wise in your own sight. Intellectualism and wisdom are not the same thing. If we are to have the childlike faith that Jesus commends, then like children, we must ask many questions. Even the ability to doubt God, to struggle against him, to wonder at his ways is rooted ultimately in him, in his nature, and in our being made in his image. So perhaps the opposite of doubt isn't faith. Maybe it's wonder. Who is like you, O Lord, among the gods? Who is like you, majestic in holiness, awesome in glorious deeds, doing wonders? Exodus 15:11. And then we get this, one of my favorite passages in the Bible, because I love a little snark, and God can be snarky. In Job 38, verses 4-7, he admonishes Job and his friends. Where were you when I laid the earth's foundation? Tell me if you understand. Who marked off its dimensions? Surely you know. Who stretched a measuring line across it? On what were its footings set? Or who laid its cornerstone while the morning stars sang together and all the angels shouted for joy? Can you find any greater wonder than a God who did these things? And then after witnessing Jesus' healings, we're told in Luke 5:26, everyone was gripped with great wonder and awe, and they praised God, exclaiming, we have seen amazing things today. God amazes me every single day. We tend to think of faith in a couple of ways, though, ways that actually oppose one another. We might think of faith as something that's completely up to us. It's our choice, much like everything else in our modern world is a choice. Or we might think of it as something entirely beyond our control, something determined by fate or destiny, or, if you're doctrinally correct, predestination. We won't get into that, because my answer to this question is that perhaps, no, faith really is both of these things. As I talk about in a whole chapter in my book on reading well, finding the good life through great books, I write about a number of virtues, and one chapter is focused on faith, which is considered a theological virtue, along with hope and love. And as I explain in the book, virtues are qualities of human excellence that are excellent because they are neither in excess or lacking. They avoid the vices of either deficiency or excess. Virtue, classically and biblically defined, is the golden mean between opposing vices. And faith, again, along with hope and love, is considered a theological virtue because its origins are in God. It's the kind of faith and hope and love that the Bible talks about are supernatural, to use the terminology of the church fathers like Aquinas, because we can't attain them in the godly sense on our own. It's a gift from God. The Bible tells us this specifically about faith. Ephesians 2:8-9 says, for by grace you have been saved by faith, and this is not of your own doing. It is the gift of God, not a result of works, that no man may boast. So we attain faith through grace. It's a gift of God. But once we receive that gift, even if it's a faith like a mustard seed, like all virtues, we have the ability to strengthen it, to grow it, and to mature it when we habitually practice it. So a colleague of mine who is a New Testament scholar describes faith as having three primary elements: belief, which is cognitive; trust, which is relational; and fidelity, which is obedience. So if we apply that to a more common human relationship, that of a child and a parent, a child may believe that she should trust her parents, and she may feel that she, have that relational ability to trust them. And she might obey them, but she might not do all of those things. She might, know she can trust her parents and feel she can trust her parents, but then disobey them. Or she might obey them, but not out of a relational trust or cognitive trust. But a robust faith in God, just as in a person, entails all three of these: that intellectual belief, that heartfelt trust, and that life of fidelity. It actually doesn't just describe a parent-child relationship, it also describes a marital relationship. And we won't have or feel this presence of those all the time, or they won't all be as strong as each other, but sort of recognizing that three-part makeup of faith can help to carry us, I think, and to support the weight of those inevitable moments that we will experience of doubt. And we will experience them. I mean, after all, the Bible in James 1:3 assures us that our faith will be tested. But the results of that testing is perseverance. So having our faith tested is actually a good thing, according to the Bible, not a bad thing. And it's also, I've touched on this, but I want to stress that it's important to distinguish between the doubts we have about God, who he is, his word, all those things, and the doubts we have about his people. And let's all admit it, we have lots of cause to have doubt about his people. It's, the church, institutions, the leaders today, but we aren't alone. Christians for 2,000 years have faced similar problems, some more than others, actually. The Protestant Reformation and the Counter-Reformation both come to mind. This was a time when the doubts were cast on the institutions and the leaders of human origin. And so when this happens, when we experience doubt, especially in human people, institutions, we need to remind ourselves and remind each other that our faith is in Christ alone. And I will tell you that I have needed to remind myself of that quite a bit, because despite what I said earlier about living, most of my life as a Christian without really experiencing negativity or doubt or obstacles from the church or any bad experiences in ministry or institutions, the past few years, couple of years, really have changed that, have opened my eyes. So I've experienced some of the things to a degree that many other people have. And so I've needed that reminder as well. But faith, along with hope and love, is a virtue. Because it comes from God, it is a gift, and it can grow. It can become a consistent and enduring quality of our character and our life, just like any other virtue. It is a gift, but it should not be taken for granted. Have no doubt about that. Know instead, maybe even wonder, that there is no question too hard for Christianity. And of course, it's one thing to affirm this theologically and to just say it, but another to embody this in daily church life. But our churches must be the places that welcome the questions and the people who ask them. So if you are having doubt with your questions, you might be the one to help the church be that place that does what Christ said, that is like a child, that grows believers who are like children, who ask questions, who are not haughty, who are humble, and who not only have faith, but have wonder too. So I'm going to end there, and I really am looking forward to our time of questions and answers. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Pryor. At this time, we're going to transition to a time of question and answering. And you can go to text.ag/V22QA to submit your questions. And you can also upvote ones that you resonate with, and that will help us choose. What I'd like to do is start off with a question of my own, and then we'll get right to some of these that have been already posted. I really like, Dr. Pryor, how you gave us examples from St. Thomas, Augustine, Pascal, Voltaire, and Job. And I find it I find it challenging that they spent a lot of time examining their beliefs and a lot of hard work. And it seems like if we do go back and read, we can see that they didn't have pat answers, and it wasn't a quick answer for them when they had to struggle with examining their beliefs and their faith. But I feel like that is a problem for us a little bit, because students that we run into, I think how do you encourage students who are examining their beliefs to persevere, and the tools they need that maybe need to cultivate to do that we kind of are weak in these days?
Yeah, I mean, of course, there's a different answer for every situation depending on what the student is struggling with. But I think part of it is for me is helping students understand that this problem of pat answers that we have is very much of our time and place. It's very modern, it's very American. It's very, fast food, cafeteria, quick hurry. I mean, that's just part of our culture. And so unfortunately, of course, the church is influenced by the culture. So I think just helping students to get beyond, to realize that this is not the norm when we think about human history, to have everything sort of in a prepackaged pat answer. And to then just ask the questions. There are so many resources out there for particular kinds of questions. But for me, I think many students that I teach, from the backgrounds that they come from, that itself, the idea that the pat answers that they were given, in the multiple choice questions or the workbooks or whatever, are not the way Christianity is done throughout most of the world. That's one of the biggest revelations of all. So getting past that, I think, is the biggest step.
Well, we have a question for you. You mentioned separating doctrines into various levels of importance. And how does one go about that process? Which doctrines are critical, do you think, and which are secondary?
I am so glad that question was asked. Okay, so the first answer that I'm going to give is connecting with what I said earlier. We don't, and I will answer according to what I believe. Some of you may not agree. I do not believe that we answer that question for ourselves. We are supposed to be part of a body of believers. Now, I'm Protestant, so for me, that means, okay, we still have a whole choice of different bodies of believers to choose from. But we have the confessional historic creeds of the church that are the basics of the faith, the creeds. And then if we are part of a church body, we have a denomination. So we have a church home. Maybe it's not even part of a denomination, but within our church, we should know how they order how they apply those creeds and confessions, how they order those doctrines. And that doesn't solve all the problems, because you go out on the internet, like I do too often, and we've got people who are battling and fighting one another on particular issues because they come from different churches. And that actually, as a Baptist, one of our primary convictions is religious liberty. So we have our set of beliefs about, all of the hot topic issues that are in the culture right now as Baptists, and we have our statements and our message, and it conflicts with those of many other churches. And so I have to, I choose the denomination that aligns with my convictions and my learning and my understanding as best as I can do, and then I choose that denomination's teachings because I believe they are true. And so within our church body, we order those doctrines and beliefs.
Yes. I mean, it is very difficult disentangling first and second order, yes. Essentials and non-essentials. And yes. I think that is the hardest part, I think.
Right. I mean, the essentials have been decided for centuries and centuries.
Right.
So, And the ones that we argue about, whether in the pamphlet wars of the 17th century or Twitter of the 21st century, those are the ones that, that I remind myself all the time that before there was Twitter, there were 17th century pamphlets, and they were doing the same thing that we're doing, but it just took more time.
I guess the important thing to remember is that whatever tradition you're in, the package you get seems to be all first order, right? Because they're not right. telling you what is just mere Christianity, but you have to do some work to decide what is the
right.
core of historic Christianity, and then what is something that can be debatable, right?
Right. And most, I mean, some denominations, maybe I shouldn't say, they say what their beliefs are on those second and third order ones, and so that's why you have to decide whether that's a church that aligns with your convictions and understanding or not.
Yeah. Let's go to this is interesting. Wait a minute. So this speaks to what you were talking about, having trouble with people behaving badly rather than God. I don't doubt my faith, but I find myself doubting the church. I find myself cynical and annoyed with the brothers and sisters I fellowship with. How do you encourage those of us that navigate doubts with the church?
Yeah, that's the question today, isn't it? So I think, first of all, I think we begin with an understanding of what church is and what it's for. This is teleology, which is part of virtue ethics, like knowing what the purpose of something is. I like to begin all the hard questions and even some of the easy ones with that question. What is something for? What is the purpose? So if we know what church is for, and obviously I'm speaking sort of very broadly and philosophically here, but this is how I approach these questions. If we know what church is for from our Christian belief, we know that the church is the bride of Christ, and it's the hands and feet of Christ on earth, and we know that it's a representation, and it's a symbol. It's a symbol of the relationship of Christ with His people, and so we know it serves this high and holy purpose. And then we also know that we are commanded not to forsake the assembly, and so we are to be obedient. We are to be part of a church. So if we know those two things, for me, that helps me with my times of annoyance. And then the rest of it, it really, and I don't mean this as a pat answer, and it's going to sound like that, but it really is about refinement. So there are a number of things that we can do. We need to, if we've made a commitment that we understand that the church, or the purpose of the church is high and holy and it cannot be changed, and that to be obedient we have to be part of a church, then the rest is like, so what do I do? How do I choose a church wisely? What does it mean for me to be involved? And how do I love these really imperfect, annoying people well? How do I serve them? How do I minister to them? And of course, sometimes we have to make a decision like this church is not one that I can be part of. I think that's a decision that should be made very, very, not very seriously and not lightly at all. But to be part of a fellowship and to love people that disappoint us and annoy us is, that is what life is. That's what life with a family is like. And it's just a refinement of our character, I think. So.
And I guess I think I've heard you say, why are we surprised that the church isn't perfect, right? I mean,
right.
It shouldn't surprise us in a broken world with broken people that the church is not all it should be.
Right. And but it's okay to be disappointed, and it's okay to hold one another accountable, right? I mean, so that's where I think there's also a when we're in relationship with people, we earn the right to come to them when we don't understand or we think they've done wrong. And so that's a very high privilege too, but it's one that we need to earn. And if we don't earn that, we don't have that right to go to people. If I can't go to my pastor and say, what's up, or why is this happening? And then the church deteriorates. So like the church depends on me and you and all of us having those relationships where we can hold one another accountable, because we've earned that right to be heard. People know we love them and we want what's right.
Right.
And then they can do the same for us.
Mm-hmm. So this comes from our non-believing friend. Why should us non-believers consider faith when he's saying that the idea of faith itself seems anti-intellectual, considering that many of the stories seem fantastical? He says Jonah and the whale, Noah, a dead guy coming back to life. So that's a little bit of a twist. You know, the whole idea of faith seems anti-intellectual to him.
I see. Well, read more literature because, you know, some of the most fantastical stories out there tell the truest stories about the human condition. Now, there's a whole range of beliefs about, you know, whether parts of the Bible are to be taken literally, or whether they're symbolic or allegorical, and all, or both. And so Christianity is pretty wide, and it includes a lot of different beliefs about how to take those stories and those narratives. But you know, the example that I'll bring, and this is just this is not this generation of students, but I would encourage you, if you've not ever seen the film Big Fish, that film sort of answers the question the way I want to answer it. The story of a father who tells tales that are so fantastical and unbelievable that they're dismissed. But then at the end, you know, it turns out that there's more truth in there than it seems to be. Now, I'm not saying the Bible is like that or anything, but I think as someone who studies and loves literature and language and words, I think that because we live in this very modern scientific world where everything has to be proven in an empirical way, that's kind of a loss, because there are so many great tales and stories throughout all of human history that aren't necessarily taken as God's word, as the Bible is and should be, I believe, but also no one ever questioned that they tell us some great truth about human existence and the nature of the universe. And so it's the big picture that's the most important. And, you know, it's, you know, just as Jesus told a parable, it's the spiritual truth from the parable that's important, but you can't separate that from the actual literal story because it's the literal story that conveys the spiritual truth. So, so I appreciate that question, and I totally understand how it seems anti-intellectual, but I would just say that understanding of what the Bible says and does is actually a superficial understanding. So dig a little deeper.
Yeah. And of course, his reference to Jesus rising from the dead, Jesus entered time and history, and we can investigate historically the very central part of Christianity, which is Jesus' resurrection. So I think on that one, he definitely could find historical evidence for that claim that he's questioning.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. There were witnesses.
Right. So here's a question. She said, or he or she says, I'm worried my faith is an accident of my birth location. Mm-hmm. Had I been born elsewhere, I would believe otherwise. How can I ensure my faith is something I own and not something I've inherited from my culture?
Oh, I love
this
question. I love this question. I think about that all the time. So it's not an accident of your birth. It's God's sovereignty. Now that, of course, that unleashes a whole host of other questions. Well, why did God sovereignly decide that that you were born here and someone else wasn't? But in his sovereignty, you were born here in this Christian culture, or in a Christian culture, and they're also. But this is why church teaching and Christian faith is so important for generations. I mean, you are the product of, and I'm speaking to whoever asked, of generations upon generations upon generations. Maybe not every person in that generation was a believer, but you came from people who are part of a Christian history, or were affected by a Christian history, even if they weren't part of it. So that's God's sovereignty, but also his blessings, his blessing to you from other people. So that's the blessing part. But you are absolutely right that I think you have an obligation to just sort of get beyond that cultural, mindset. I mean, I refer to this story a lot. The famous parable that David Foster Wallace said in his commencement speech at Oberlin a number of years ago, where he says, there are three fish goldfish swimming in a bowl, and one fish swims by the other two and says, I'm not saying it very well, but how's the water? And the other fish says, what water? Because when you're in the water, you don't even know what water is. And for many of us who were born in a Christian culture, we don't even know what anything else is. And so we can interrogate that in so many ways, again, by reading literature, but by, talking to other people. We live in this global village now, so it's easy to connect with people who have different backgrounds, read different books, and just examine yourself. Absolutely. And ask those questions to see if this faith really is yours or just something you inherited.
Yes, and I would say that would be great. And the wonderful thing is that the truth claims of Christianity can be investigated and examined. So you don't have to,
right.
He or she doesn't have to have a blind faith, like you were saying. It's never recommended. Let's see. Many people today identify as spiritual, but not religious, and have turned to New Age egoistic ideals. How is the Christian faith a better alternative to this pathway of making your own meaning?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And that's a good description of where we are today. And I guess I do think that the trajectory I think we will see, as I kind of alluded to, I mean, really it's in Walt Whitman's poem all the way back to the 19th century. Like, we all want something that's bigger and beyond ourselves. I think that, that's how God created us, and making our own meaning might seem meaningful and good if we're coming from like maybe no spirituality or a twisted, perverted spirituality. But ultimately, we were made to have something that's more than just inside ourselves. And it's a long history of how we got here. I would recommend Tara Isabel Burton's Strange Rights, if you want that history, or Carl Trueman's The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, sort of tell how we got here. But I think Christianity, it kind of offers both. There's that old expression, it's a relationship, not a religion. And there's truth in that is true. It is a personal relationship with the God of the universe through Jesus Christ. But also it's more than that. We are part of so it's like both things. Like, it was a personal, individual relationship, but we also are part of a body. And so that's how I look at it. And I don't think the New Age kind of spiritual but not religious thing is ultimately sustainable. It's only as sustainable as we are as individuals. And I don't think anyone can last that long with that kind of self-reliance. I mean, even Emerson figured that out.
And you mentioned before that we need community. And I think that in our Western culture, the emphasis is on, being individualistic, sort of. Even in something like this, a student may think they're just sort of on their own, trying to figure all this out.
Right.
So I like that you encourage that it has to be done in community. And we have many Christian groups at A&M where students can come and ask their questions, especially at Ratio Christi. I like this question because she says, how do we deal with uncertainty? So doubt is, I think, uncomfortable, and people don't like uncertainty. They want to be certain, like 100%. So she even talks in percentages, or he. How do we deal with uncertainty when we want to be devoted to God? It's hard to pray, dear God, I'm 90% sure you're there and I love and trust you, but it's still high, but it still causes me some tension in my prayer life. So they're seeking, what I think is, because doubts have not been welcome, or questions haven't been welcome in the church. So we don't want to have them. We want to get rid of them. And they're seeking certainty. And it's kind of maybe an enlightenment thing going on, that everything has to be 100%, that your faith can't have any questions that linger.
Yeah, that's such an interesting word, certainty, because there are other words that we use within the Christian tradition that have a similar meaning, but are a little different enough, like such as assurance. And so assurance is a biblical word, but it's not quite the same as certainty. And then I talked about wonder. It's just there's an assurance, faith, hope, wonder. I think if we look at the Bible and we look at some of the great stories, like we think of Abraham and Isaac. Abraham obeyed God in taking his son. He believed that God would provide a sacrifice, and God did. But he had I would never use the word certainty to describe Abraham's faith. And I don't think the Bible tells us to be certain in the way that we use that word in the modern age. And so we do like to have certainty as part of our culture. That's a cultural construct as well. We analyze everything, we test everything, we have all these choices, and we have FOMO and YOLO, and so we're overridden with anxiety about making the best decision possible and being as certain as we possibly can. That's part of our culture. It's not I don't really think it's a biblical idea. It's assurance, it's hope, it's faith, and it's just that wonder and amazement that God, and God will meet you where you are. The Bible tells us to taste and see. It tells us to seek and we will find. But it's not like we know exactly what's going to be at the end, and at the end of that trust in Him. I mean, and that's something that I've grown a lot in my life, is just trusting Him with the small little things, not knowing how they will turn out, and then just standing back and being amazed, like, oh, okay, that's how you wanted this to work out, God. So there's faith and hope and trust there, but not certainty.
I like that. This person asked, could you further expand on the point that we all have moral blind spots, as well as your example of slavery, but you could use other examples?
Yeah. So I was talking there about cultural blind spots. I mean, I think as individuals, we certainly do have blind spots. We think we're one way and we don't realize that we're another way. But in terms of cultural blind spots, I mean, there are just so many. I really had to wrestle with this when I was studying the period of the slave trade and reading Christians who were rationalizing this thing that is so undeniably evil now that we can see, and I cannot comprehend how people could look at that and come up with any rationalization for it. And yet, in studying that period, I saw how there's a lot going on that's like the frog in the pot put to a boil, right? So life was sort of hard and for everyone, and laborers were not treated much better than slaves, and children were sent down chimneys, and women worked in fact. Everyone was treated in a brutal way unless they were, among the most powerful. And so everything, it wasn't as in that context, it was easy to rationalize. And we have to ask ourselves, like, well, what are we not seeing because we're so used to it? And we've just accepted it. And there are lots of examples that we could, I think, I don't necessarily need to name any. I can if you want, but we're no different.
Yes. Well, let's have one more question, because this one is interesting. What's the point of deconstructing if at the end you still have essentially the same core beliefs and values? So we're encouraging people to deconstruct and reconstruct. So this person wants to know, well, what's the point?
Mm-hmm. Okay, so it really depends on what you're deconstructing, right? So for many Christians today, I think that they have discovered that the things they thought were essentials of the faith were really sort of cultural applications. And it can be kind of mind-blowing. I'll use an example that I've seen a lot. And I'm just, there'll be different iterations of this. But I've seen a lot of young people come through my classes and through my office whose minds were blown that to realize that their salvation and their happiness and their marriages and their future and their goodness before God did not depend on their virginity. Like they had been so taught or understood that losing their virginity before marriage was what would ruin them. I mean, that's an idea, ruin in every single way. Now, I am not God, there's a purpose for marriage, as I said, and there's a purpose for sexuality, and we do want to honor God with those things, and that is good and holy. But there's no one particular sin that is going to ruin us before God, or avoiding a particular sin will guarantee us happiness and success and whatever. And I have watched a lot of students go through and try to figure out, okay, what really is the teaching of sexuality and marriage and purity, as opposed to what I've understood my whole life and has haunted me and really just, put me in years of therapy. I've seen lots of that happen to a lot of students. So that's just one example. So you might deconstruct the sort of cultural 20th century application of a biblical idea, a wrong application of a biblical idea. So maybe the core beliefs and values are the same when you come out, but you've kind of stripped away that rotten part of it. And that's really just one example.
And that's very helpful. And that's what we're encouraging, right? To disentangle and disenculturate your faith. Thank you, Dr. Pryor, for this great discussion and for giving us the tools for building our faith on solid ground. And I just want to urge each of you to continue the conversation in community with others in one of the Christian groups here at Texas A&M. We thank you all that you joined us online on this cold, wet, icy evening. And we're asking you to please fill out the survey and tell us what you think. It's text.ag/V22 survey. So thank you, Dr. Pryor, for joining us. Maybe next time it will be in person.
I hope so.